Hitler himself declared in September 1943 that the river would be held at all costs. The intention was to transform the western bank into a fortress line, relying on the broad expanse of the river, often more than 800 to 1,000 meters wide, with steep western banks, to halt the Soviet advance. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was tasked with conducting a massive retreat while avoiding encirclement, preserving as many formations as possible for the coming defensive battles. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin and Stavka recognized the opportunity to press the retreating German forces and prevent them from consolidating along the Dnieper. Orders were issued for a rapid pursuit, and multiple fronts, Voronezh, Steppe, Southwestern, and Central, were directed to advance westward simultaneously. By September, nearly 2.6 million Soviet troops were engaged in the operation to reach and cross the river, supported by more than 51,000 artillery pieces, 2,400 tanks, and 2,850 aircraft. Opposing them, Army Group South fielded around 1.25 million men, with approximately 12,600 artillery pieces, 2,100 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft, though many formations were weakened from the heavy fighting at Kursk and the subsequent retreats. The terrain and timing of the campaign made the operation extraordinarily difficult. The Soviet advance coincided with the rainy season. Roads deteriorated rapidly, turning into mud that slowed mechanized units. Supply lines stretched thin as the Red Army raced across recently liberated territories devastated by 2 years of German occupation. Bridges had been destroyed, rail networks were in ruins, and the river itself presented a formidable challenge. Steep banks, wide spans, and strong currents, especially in its central and southern sectors. Despite these obstacles, Stavka's orders were explicit. The Dnieper had to be crossed quickly before the Germans could fortify the western bank. Stalin emphasized the need to seize bridgeheads at any cost, often ordering troops to cross without waiting for proper engineering equipment. This directive, issued in late September 1943, set the stage for what became one of the largest and bloodiest river-crossing operations in military history. As Soviet forces advanced, civilians became part of the operational landscape. Hundreds of thousands of villagers, long under German occupation, were caught between the retreating Wehrmacht and the advancing Red Army. Many were pressed into service constructing fortifications, ferrying supplies, or forced into evacuations. German engineers dynamited villages and fields to deny shelter and resources, while the Soviets requisitioned boats, barges, and even makeshift rafts from local populations for the crossings. The German command attempted to stabilize the situation by constructing what became known as the East Wall, a series of defensive positions anchored on the western bank of the Dnieper. However, the pace of the Soviet advance and the vast length of the river made it impossible to fully fortify. By late September, many positions were only partially prepared, defended by rearguards and elements still retreating westward. This convergence of speed, desperation, and geography created the conditions for the Dnieper crossing campaign. Over the next 2 months, tens of thousands of Soviet troops would attempt to storm the river with whatever means were available, while German forces sought to hold the western bank through a combination of entrenched positions, counterattacks, and destruction of crossing points. The scale was immense. The operation stretched from Smolensk in the north to the Black Sea in the south, involving 5 Soviet fronts in coordinated assaults. The strategic goal was not merely to establish bridgeheads, but to liberate Kiev and cut off Army Group South from its lines of retreat into Ukraine and Romania. For the Germans, success meant buying time, stabilizing the front, and preventing the Red Army from breaking into the open plains of right bank Ukraine. By late September 1943, both sides recognized that the Dnieper would be a decisive line. For the Soviets, it was the gateway to Kiev and further advances into Eastern Europe. For the Germans, it was the last natural barrier before the Carpathians and the pre-war borders of Poland. The stage was set for a campaign that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and earn its place in history as one of the bloodiest river battles ever fought. The German retreat to the Dnieper in September 1943 unfolded under extraordinary pressure. Following the collapse of their defensive positions after Kursk and Kharkov, Army Group South conducted a withdrawal of nearly 300 kilometers across central Ukraine. Manstein's objective was to bring his divisions intact to the western bank of the river, where Hitler demanded the establishment of the Ostwall, or East Wall. This was to be a line of natural fortresses anchored on the Dnieper's formidable geography. Yet the idea of a continuous, fortified defensive belt across more than 1,000 kilometers was far removed from reality. German engineers lacked the manpower, materials, and time to build lasting defenses. Instead, many of the fortified zones consisted of thin rearguards hastily entrenched with trenches, machine gun nests, and scattered artillery. Soviet forces did not allow the Wehrmacht breathing room. Stavka issued directives on 6 September 1943 for a massive pursuit operation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov coordinated multiple fronts, urging them forward without pause. The Voronezh front under General Nikolai Vatutin pressed southwest toward Kiev, while the Steppe front under Ivan Konev advanced across Poltava. In the south, the southwestern front under Rodion Malinovsky and the southern front under Fyodor Tolbukin drove toward Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye. Northward, Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front pushed through Gomel toward the river. Together, these operations involved more than 2.6 million Red Army soldiers, with nearly 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, 51,000 artillery pieces, and 2,800 aircraft. German forces, though still formidable, were weakened. Army Group South fielded roughly 1.25 million troops, supported by about 2,100 tanks and assault guns and 12,600 artillery pieces. However, many divisions were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength after the summer's battles. The Sixth Army, reconstituted after its destruction at Stalingrad, fought alongside the Eighth Army and the First Panzer Army, but shortages of replacements, fuel, and vehicles constrained their mobility. Manstein repeatedly requested freedom to conduct elastic defense, retreating to favorable positions, while inflicting attrition on Soviet forces. Hitler, however, insisted on static defense, ordering cities like Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk held to the last. This tension between strategic logic and political directives shaped German actions throughout the campaign. The first contact with the Dnieper came earlier than expected. By mid-September, forward Soviet detachments reached the eastern bank in several sectors. Stavka's order was unambiguous. Crossings had to be attempted immediately, regardless of preparation. Stalin emphasized speed, fearing that any delay would allow the Germans to entrench. Red Army commanders pushed infantry across on fishing boats, rafts, makeshift pontoons, and even by swimming with rifles strapped to their backs. Engineering units struggled to build bridges under fire, often lacking proper equipment because supply convoys had been slowed by mud and destroyed infrastructure. In the Kiev sector, Vatutin's Voronezh front launched probing attacks across the river north and south of the city. German forces from the 4th Panzer Army resisted with artillery fire from the steep western bank, inflicting heavy casualties. Still, Soviet troops managed to secure tenuous bridgeheads at Lyutezh and Bukhrin in late September. At Bukhrin, the crossings were particularly costly. Entire battalions were lost when rafts capsized under shell fire, yet survivors clawed their way up the cliffs to dig shallow foxholes on the far side. These small lodgements became the seeds of larger bridgeheads. Farther south, Konev's steppe front advanced on Poltava and Kremenchuk. Here the Red Army captured boats from local civilians, requisitioned ferries, and used improvised means to establish footholds across the river by the end of September. Malinovsky and Tolbukin's forces reached the river near Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, confronting some of the strongest German defenses. The Germans attempted to destroy bridges and dams to block crossings, but Soviet reconnaissance units still managed to cross at night, clinging to fragile positions despite counterattacks. The speed and scale of these operations strained both sides. Soviet casualties mounted rapidly. Reports from the Voronezh front indicated that some rifle divisions lost up to 30% of their strength during the first attempts to cross. For example, the 240th Rifle Division recorded more than Weygust 500 killed and wounded in just 3 days of operations near Bukhrin. German losses, though lighter in absolute terms, were significant given their reduced manpower. The 19th Panzer Division reported fewer than 50 operational tanks by late September, down from more than 150 earlier that summer. Civilian populations played a crucial role, often involuntarily. Villagers along the eastern bank were pressed to provide boats and carts, while thousands assisted in carrying supplies to the river under bombardment. German forces carried out forced evacuations on the western side, relocating populations to deny the Red Army intelligence or logistical support. Villages suspected of aiding Soviet crossings were burned, creating waves of refugees streaming eastward, even as fighting raged at the riverbanks. The German High Command attempted to stabilize the front by organizing counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads. Mobile reserves such as the 7th Panzer Division and elements of the Grossdeutschland Division were thrown into action. However, these formations, depleted by prior battles, lacked the strength for decisive blows. Soviet artillery superiority also hampered German counterattacks. In some sectors, the Red Army massed up to 200 guns per kilometer of front, firing continuously to suppress enemy defenses as new waves of infantry crossed. By early October, dozens of bridgeheads dotted the western bank of the Dnieper. Some were only a few hundred meters deep, little more than tenuous toeholds under constant attack. Others, like those at Liutej and Kremenchuk, expanded into positions capable of supporting future offensives. Though fragile, these lodgements forced the Germans to disperse their forces along the entire length of the river. Manstein warned Berlin that without reinforcements, Army Group South could not both contain the bridgeheads and hold major cities. His request for additional divisions went largely unanswered. The opening phase of the Dnieper crossing thus set the tone for the weeks to come. The Soviet strategy of relentless pressure produced footholds, but at immense cost. Tens of thousands of men were killed or wounded in the first fortnight of crossings alone. German resistance was determined but ultimately reactive, unable to fully prevent the establishment of Soviet bridgeheads. What had begun as a pursuit after Kursk was now transforming into one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire war, fought across hundreds of kilometers of riverbank. The crossing was only beginning, and the struggle for control of the western bank would soon escalate into a campaign of attrition involving millions of men, thousands of tanks, and the fate of Ukraine itself. The strategic dimension of the Dnieper campaign reveals both the ambition of the Soviet leadership and the desperation of the German command. After the failure at Kursk and the retreat across eastern Ukraine, Hitler issued a series of directives insisting that the Dnieper line be transformed into a fortress barrier. On 3rd September 1943, he declared that the river was to be held like a wall of stone, demanding that every major city on the western bank be fortified and defended to the last man. German military planners called this concept the Panther-Wotan line, later referred to more broadly as the East Wall. In theory, the line was formidable. It was anchored on the wide Dnieper itself, bolstered by steep western banks in many sectors, and designed to run through major strongpoints such as Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporozhye. But in practice, it existed mostly on paper. German engineering units had been given only weeks to prepare positions, and they lacked both manpower and raw materials. Trenches were shallow, bunkers incomplete, and wire obstacles minimal. Rearguard units struggled to delay the Soviet advance long enough to allow construction to proceed. By mid-September, many positions consisted of little more than scattered machine gun nests and artillery pits hastily dug into the slopes. Manstein, commanding Army Group South, understood the impossibility of holding such an extensive front. He repeatedly requested permission to conduct a mobile defense, retreating selectively to concentrate reserves for counterattacks. Hitler rejected this approach, demanding that no territory be surrendered without a fight. The result was strategic overstretch. Divisions were dispersed thinly across hundreds of kilometers, unable to cover every crossing point, while Soviet forces were free to probe for weak spots. For the Soviets, the strategic objective was clear: force the Dnieper before the Germans could transform it into a true defensive wall. Stalin and Stavka issued orders to all fronts to reach the river as quickly as possible and establish bridgeheads at any cost. The rationale was both military and political. Militarily, a rapid crossing would prevent the Wehrmacht from consolidating and deny them a winter defensive line. Politically, Stalin was eager to liberate the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, before the anniversary of the October Revolution in November 1943. This deadline weighed heavily on Soviet planning, driving urgency into operations that might otherwise have paused for regrouping. Logistics were a major challenge for both sides. The Red Army, despite its momentum, was advancing across territory devastated by 2 years of occupation. Bridges had been destroyed, railways dismantled, and roads degraded. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers to depots east of Kharkov and Kursk. Fuel and ammunition shortages frequently slowed advances, while the mud season, the Rasputitsa turned dirt roads into morasses that bogged down trucks and artillery. To sustain momentum, the Soviets relied heavily on local resources, requisitioning carts, horses, and boats from villagers, often stripping entire communities of their means of survival. The Germans, retreating westward, faced logistical collapse of a different kind. Demolitions carried out by their own engineers denied them infrastructure, while Soviet air superiority made daytime movement hazardous. Luftwaffe fighter units, stretched thin, could not prevent constant harassment of German convoys. Losses of fuel and vehicles during the retreat meant that many divisions arrived at the Dnieper understrength and exhausted. For example, by late September, the 11th Panzer Division reported fewer than 50 operational tanks, while several infantry divisions were reduced to 3,000 to 4,000 men, barely a third of their authorized strength. Propaganda on both sides also played a role in shaping operations. Soviet broadcasts hailed the drive to the Dnieper as a liberation crusade, promising the Ukrainian population freedom from occupation. Posters urged soldiers to seize the Dnieper, no matter the cost. German propaganda, meanwhile, painted the East Wall as an impregnable barrier, the shield of Europe against Bolshevism. Civilians were forced to construct fortifications and assist in demolitions, their labor woven into the German narrative of defending Europe, yet morale in occupied villages was divided. Some supported the Red Army's advance, while others, fearing reprisals or deportations, fled westward with the retreating Wehrmacht. Strategic miscalculations were evident on both sides. German reliance on the Dnieper as an absolute defensive line underestimated Soviet engineering capabilities and determination. They assumed the river itself would buy them months of reprieve. In contrast, Soviet planning overemphasized speed at the expense of preparation. Many crossings were attempted without sufficient artillery support, bridging equipment, or coordination, leading to catastrophic losses when troops tried to force crossings against entrenched German fire. Still, the imbalance of manpower and resources favored the Soviets. By early October 1943, they had assembled more than 2.6 million men and nearly 2,500 tanks along the river. The Germans could not match these numbers across the vast front. Manstein's hope was to concentrate armored reserves for counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads, but the sheer number of Soviet lodgements, dozens along the river's length, meant German strength was diluted, their armor racing from one crisis to another. Kiev loomed as the central prize of the campaign. Stalin's directive to liberate the city before 7th of November meant that Soviet commanders placed extraordinary emphasis on establishing bridgeheads north and south of the capital. The Voronezh front under Vatutin concentrated on the Lyutezh and Bukrin sectors. Bukrin, with its steep banks, proved disastrous, costing tens of thousands of Soviet casualties, while Lyutezh, though less promising at first glance, would eventually become the launching point for the November offensive. These early decisions reflected the tension between political deadlines and military realities, a recurring theme in Soviet planning. By late September, the strategic picture was set. The Germans clung to their incomplete east wall, attempting to hold strong points like Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, while their stretched divisions counterattacked across the western bank. The Soviets, driven by Stalin's deadlines and their own momentum, had secured multiple fragile bridgeheads, but at extraordinary cost in manpower. Both sides understood that the coming battles would determine not only the fate of Kiev, but the control of all right bank Ukraine. The Dnieper was no longer simply a river. It had become the dividing line between retreat and advance, between Hitler's last defensive hopes in the east and Stalin's vision of rolling the war into Eastern Europe. The first clashes along the Dnieper unfolded in late September 1943, when Soviet forward detachments began attempting crossings on a broad front. The strategy was simple in design, but brutal in execution. Infantry units were ordered to seize footholds on the western bank with whatever means were available, holding them until engineers could establish more permanent bridges. The reality was that most attempts relied on improvised craft fishing boats, rafts made from barrels, logs tied together, or even doors ripped from village houses. Units without any available materials were instructed to swim across under fire. The river at this time of year was wide, often exceeding 700 to 1,000 meters, with fast currents and steep embankments. Against German artillery and machine guns positioned on the heights of the western bank, the effort became one of the most costly undertakings of the war. One of the earliest sectors to witness serious fighting was near Bucharin, south of Kiev. Here, the Voronezh front under General Vatutin launched repeated attempts to establish bridgeheads. German defenders from the 4th Panzer Army held commanding positions on the high western bank, supported by artillery dug into fortified ridges. Soviet infantry, ferried across in waves, suffered devastating losses. Entire battalions were annihilated before reaching the far shore. In some instances, men who made it across were pinned against the bank, unable to climb the slopes under continuous fire. Reports from late September indicate that Soviet divisions lost up to one-third of their strength within days, with casualty figures for some regiments surpassing 1,500 killed and wounded in a single crossing attempt. At Kremenchuk, the steppe front under Konev faced similar challenges. German forces from Army Group South had mined the river banks and concentrated artillery on likely crossing points. Nonetheless, Soviet reconnaissance identified a lightly defended sector near Svitlovodsk, where local villagers pointed out hidden boats and rafts. Under cover of night, Soviet units slipped across, establishing a tenuous lodgment by 25 September. German counterattacks followed within hours, with elements of the 19th Panzer Division striking hard against the bridgehead. The fighting was close quarters and ferocious, but Soviet forces held on, gradually reinforcing their positions until engineers could ferry artillery pieces across. Farther south near Zaporozhye, the southwestern and southern fronts met some of the stiffest resistance of the campaign. German defenses in this sector were stronger, anchored on the industrial complexes and hydroelectric installations of the Dnieper Dam. Hitler had ordered the region held at all costs due to its strategic and symbolic value. Soviet troops attempted crossings near Nikopol and downstream from Zaporozhye, but many of these efforts were repulsed with heavy losses. The Luftwaffe, though weakened overall, concentrated what remained of its fighter and bomber units in the area, striking Soviet pontoon bridges and ferries. Losses mounted quickly, with engineering units reporting the destruction of dozens of boats within days. Despite this, Soviet persistence eventually produced small footholds, though they remained under constant threat of counterattack. In the northern sector, Rokossovsky's central front pushed toward Gomel and attempted crossings along the upper Dnieper. The river here, though narrower, was still heavily defended. German rearguards from the Second Army constructed strongpoints around towns and villages, forcing Soviet infantry to clear positions house by house before even reaching the riverbank. Crossing attempts in this region achieved some success, but progress was slower due to terrain and logistical obstacles. Nonetheless, by early October, Soviet units had secured bridgeheads near Loev and Rechitsa, forcing the Germans to commit reserves to contain them. Morale and civilian impact during these early engagements were significant. For Soviet soldiers, the orders were explicit and unforgiving: seize the western bank or perish. Political officers enforced Stalin's directive that the river had to be crossed immediately. Accounts describe rifle divisions thrown into the water repeatedly, regardless of earlier failures. For local civilians, the situation was catastrophic. Villagers were forced to surrender boats and rafts, often under threat of execution if they refused. Entire communities were stripped of food and livestock as Soviet forces requisitioned supplies to sustain the crossings. Meanwhile, German forces carried out mass evacuations on the Western Bank, fearing collaboration. Villages suspected of aiding the Red Army were burned, and thousands of civilians were marched westward with retreating German columns. The scale of losses shocked even hardened commanders. In the first week of October, Soviet sources admitted unofficially that tens of thousands of men had been lost in the initial attempts. German commanders, for their part, noted that while Soviet casualties were enormous, the relentless pressure meant that every time one bridgehead was contained, another would appear along the river. The 4th Panzer Army reported exhaustion as its divisions were forced to redeploy constantly, counterattacking in one sector only to face fresh Soviet crossings in another. The unexpected outcome of these early engagements was the sheer number of bridgeheads established. By mid-October 1943, Soviet forces had created more than 20 lodgements on the Western Bank, ranging from tiny pockets of a few hundred meters to larger bridgeheads capable of sustaining divisions. While many were precarious and under constant German fire, their very existence undermined the German plan of a solid east wall. The Wehrmacht could not cover the entire length of the river, and Soviet persistence ensured that somewhere footholds would take root. The first clashes at the Dnieper revealed the brutal logic of Stalin's strategy. Crossing attempts were made simultaneously on a massive front, overwhelming German ability to respond. Losses were accepted as the price of success. For the Germans, the opening engagements exposed the limits of their manpower and the impossibility of creating a continuous defense. Even where they inflicted devastating casualties, they could not prevent the Soviets from establishing multiple bridgeheads. The stage was now set for a drawn-out battle of attrition in which both sides would commit ever greater resources to control the blood-soaked banks of the Dnieper. The weeks that followed the first Soviet crossings turned the Dnieper line into a zone of unrelenting crisis. What began as scattered lodgements along the western bank grew into a chain of contested bridgeheads stretching from Smolensk in the north to Zaporozhye in the south. German high command, alarmed by the breadth of the threat, scrambled to contain these penetrations. Army Group South and Army Group Center shifted mobile reserves from one sector to another, often arriving only after Soviet forces had expanded their footholds. Manstein himself described the front as a series of fires, each demanding immediate attention, none of which can be fully extinguished. Escalation was inevitable because neither side could afford to relinquish ground. For the Soviets, Stalin's directive left no room for retreat. The river crossings were to be pressed until they succeeded. For the Germans, losing the Western Bank meant not only ceding Ukraine, but also opening the road to Poland and the Balkans. Thus, October 1943 witnessed some of the most intense fighting of the war, with both armies pouring men and material into the Dnieper sector. At Bukrin, the most infamous of the bridgeheads, the Voronezh front under Vatutin continued to throw divisions across the river despite catastrophic losses. The terrain was unfavorable. Steep, forested slopes and narrow approaches left Soviet attackers exposed to concentrated German fire. The 4th Panzer Army, though heavily strained, maintained a dense network of artillery and mortars, supported by mobile counterattacks from panzer units. Between late September and mid-October, repeated Soviet offensives at Bukrin failed to break out. The 27th Army and 40th Army suffered severe losses, with estimates of more than 250,000 casualties across all Soviet formations engaged in the Kiev sector during the autumn. Despite these sacrifices, the Bukrin bridgehead remained a stalemate too costly to abandon, yet too narrow to expand decisively. In contrast, the Lyutezh bridgehead north of Kiev offered more favorable ground. Initially overlooked, Soviet forces gradually shifted attention there in October. German defenses in this area were less developed, as the 4th Panzer Army concentrated resources farther south. By quietly transferring forces from Bukrin to Lyutezh, the Soviets laid the groundwork for their eventual offensive to liberate Kiev. This adaptation demonstrated the flexibility of Soviet operational planning, but it also highlighted the immense human cost of earlier miscalculations. Farther south, the battle for Zaporozhye epitomized the escalation of the Dnieper campaign. Hitler had ordered the city held at all costs, considering it a vital industrial and symbolic center. The 1st Panzer Army and the 6th Army organized a strong defense, supported by the remnants of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet. In mid-October, Malinovsky's southwestern front launched a massive assault, employing 3 combined arms armies with heavy artillery support. Soviet troops forced crossings downstream, gradually enveloping the city. By 14th October, Zaporozhye fell after fierce street fighting. The Germans suffered heavy losses in men and equipment, retreating westward toward Dnipropetrovsk. The fall of Zaporozhye represented a major Soviet victory, shattering German hopes of holding the central Dnieper sector. The weather exacerbated the crisis for both sides. October rains transformed roads into mud, hindering the movement of tanks, artillery, and supply columns. Soviet logistical units struggled to ferry ammunition and reinforcements across makeshift bridges, constantly targeted by German artillery and aircraft. German divisions likewise found it nearly impossible to redeploy armor quickly enough to contain Soviet bridgeheads. Fuel shortages plagued the Wehrmacht, forcing panzer units to conserve movement for counterattacks rather than patrols. The mobility that had once defined German operational art was eroding under the combined pressure of attrition and terrain. Political tensions deepened as the scale of casualties became clear. Stalin pressed commanders for faster progress, warning them that delays would not be tolerated. Reports from the front described rifle divisions reduced to half strength within weeks. Replacement drafts were rushed forward, often poorly trained and inadequately equipped. On the German side, Hitler's insistence on holding every position created conflicts with Manstein, who argued for flexible withdrawals. The dismissal of generals who suggested retreats reflected the growing politicization of German military decisions. Morale among German officers eroded as they were forced to execute unrealistic orders. Internationally, the scale of the battle did not go unnoticed. Allied observers in Moscow reported astonishment at the ferocity of the crossings, though Western newspapers often underestimated the casualties. Soviet propaganda highlighted the heroism of Red Army soldiers storming the river, while German reports emphasized the destruction inflicted on Soviet attackers. Both sides used the Dnieper to shape narratives of resilience and determination, even as the human toll mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The escalation phase also saw the beginning of large-scale partisan activity supporting Soviet operations. In the forests and villages west of the river, partisan detachments disrupted German communications, destroyed bridges, and provided intelligence on troop movements. Though their impact was uneven, in some sectors they significantly hampered German attempts to redeploy reserves against Soviet bridgeheads. German reprisals against suspected collaborators were harsh, further alienating the local population. By the end of October 1943, the Dnieper had been transformed into a front of unprecedented intensity. More than 20 major Soviet bridgeheads were in place, each contested fiercely. German counterattacks inflicted severe losses, but could not eliminate them all. Soviet troops, despite suffering some of the heaviest casualties of the war, continued to press forward, slowly expanding their lodgements. The crisis for the Wehrmacht was clear. The East Wall had failed to hold, and the Red Army now had a foothold on the western bank of one of Europe's greatest rivers. The escalation of the Dnieper campaign revealed the limits of both sides. For the Soviets, rapid advances came at appalling cost, but their sheer numbers and determination ensured progress. For the Germans, tactical skill and local counterattacks bought time, but could not reverse the tide. The battle was no longer about preventing crossings, it was about containing them long enough to stabilize the front. Yet with every passing week, the balance shifted further in favor of the Red Army, setting the stage for the decisive struggles of November. By November 1943, the Dnieper campaign had reached its peak. The scattered Soviet bridgeheads, once tenuous, were transformed into major staging grounds for offensive operations. The Germans, unable to eliminate them, faced the grim reality of defending an enormous front with depleted divisions. It was in this period that some of the largest and most decisive battles of the campaign unfolded, marking the climax of one of the war's bloodiest river struggles. The battle for Kiev became the centerpiece of this phase. Stalin, determined to liberate the Ukrainian capital before the anniversary of the October Revolution on 7th of November, pressured Vatutin's Voronezh front to achieve results at any cost. The initial focus remained on the Bucharin bridgehead, where Soviet forces had already sacrificed tens of thousands of men in futile attempts to expand. Repeated assaults in October achieved minimal gains, as German forces from the 4th Panzer Army held the high ground with artillery and armor support. Soviet divisions crossing in daylight suffered enormous casualties. By late October, Vatutin conceded that Bucharin could not serve as the main springboard for Kiev. The decision was made to shift the axis of attack to the Liutezh bridgehead, north of the city. The redeployment was a massive undertaking involving the secret transfer of entire armies, artillery batteries, and tank units across the river. Soviet engineers worked relentlessly to construct pontoon bridges under cover of night, while deception measures, dummy tanks, false radio traffic, and diversionary bombardments kept German attention fixed on Bucharin. By the first days of November, more than 200,000 men, 3,000 guns, and several tank corps had been moved north in preparation for the final assault. On 3 November 1943, the Red Army launched its offensive from the Liutezh bridgehead. The initial artillery barrage involved over 7,000 guns and mortars, unleashing one of the heaviest bombardments of the war to date. Infantry and armor surged forward, striking weak points in the German 4th Panzer Army's line. Resistance was fierce but fractured. German divisions such as the 20th Panzer Grenadier and 7th Infantry were already under strength, with battalions reduced to a few hundred men. By 5th of November, Soviet forces had broken through and begun encircling German positions north of Kiev. On 6th November, after 2 days of street fighting, Soviet troops entered Kiev itself. The liberation of the city was a major political and military triumph, achieved just in time for Stalin's deadline. Yet victory came at immense cost. Soviet records indicate more than 80,000 casualties during the battles around Kiev in October and November. German losses were also heavy, with several divisions reduced to remnants. The capture of Kiev marked the collapse of the German East Wall in the central sector and opened the road to right-bank Ukraine. In the south, the battle for Dnipropetrovsk and the lower Dnieper also reached a climax. Malinovsky's southwestern front and Tolbukin's southern front pressed relentlessly against German 1st Panzer Army and 6th Army positions. Hitler's orders to hold cities to the last man turned Dnipropetrovsk into a fortress, but Soviet pressure on multiple bridgeheads gradually forced a German withdrawal. By late October, Soviet forces had enveloped the city from the north and south. On 25 October, Dnipropetrovsk fell, with Soviet reports claiming the capture of over 10,000 prisoners and large quantities of abandoned equipment. German survivors retreated west toward Krivoy Rog, leaving behind a devastated industrial center. Simultaneously, the battle for Zaporozhye concluded with Soviet victory earlier in mid-October, forcing the Germans to fall back from another key stronghold. The cumulative effect was to strip Army Group South of its defensive anchor points, forcing continuous retreat across the Ukrainian steppe. The Luftwaffe, though committed heavily, could not stem the tide. By November, the Soviet Air Force had achieved effective superiority along much of the Dnieper. German bomber raids managed to destroy some Soviet pontoon bridges, but losses of aircraft and fuel limited their operational reach. Soviet air units, numbering more than 2,800 aircraft during the campaign, harassed German columns, strafed retreating units, and supported bridgehead expansions. Luftwaffe's strength dwindled to fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft in Army Group South sector. Civilian suffering intensified during this peak of the campaign. Villages along the river and in recaptured zones were caught between retreating German units and advancing Soviets. German forces carried out scorched earth policies, destroying infrastructure, burning crops, and deporting populations. The Red Army, while liberating Ukrainian territories, requisitioned food and shelter from civilians to sustain their rapid advance. Reports from liberated Kiev described severe shortages of bread and fuel, with much of the population left homeless by bombing and shelling. The psychological strain on combatants was immense. German divisions reported plummeting morale as they were forced to retreat from positions that had been declared impregnable only weeks earlier. Desertions increased, particularly among non-German auxiliary units. Soviet troops, though buoyed by victory, were exhausted by continuous assaults. Accounts from rifle divisions describe entire regiments reduced to 200-300 men after successive crossing attempts. Still, political officers and Stavka directives drove them forward, ensuring that momentum was not lost. By mid-November, the peak of the campaign had reshaped the strategic balance in Ukraine. The Red Army held Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporozhye, and maintained more than 20 bridgeheads along the Dnieper. German Army Group South, though still intact, had been forced into retreat after retreat, its divisions eroded by attrition and its East Wall concept discredited. The Wehrmacht still had the ability to counterattack, but the loss of major urban centers and the crumbling of defensive lines signaled a decisive shift. The crossing of the Dnieper at its peak phase represented not just a tactical achievement, but a strategic victory. The Red Army had shattered the largest natural barrier in Eastern Europe, broken through Hitler's last major defensive plan in Ukraine, and paved the way for further offensives into right bank Ukraine. The price was enormous, hundreds of thousands of casualties, but the momentum was irreversible. The Dnieper, once envisioned as the German bulwark, had been transformed into the staging ground for Soviet advance deeper into Europe. The aftermath of Kiev's liberation did not bring an end to the fighting along the Dnieper. Instead, it marked a transition into a phase of continuous German counterattacks and Soviet adaptation. Hitler, infuriated by the loss of Ukraine's capital, demanded an immediate effort to retake the city. Army Group South, already battered, was ordered to regroup and strike back against Vatutin's forces. On 15 November 1943, the 48th Panzer Corps and elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, launched counteroffensives north and west of Kiev. These attacks temporarily forced the Red Army to give ground, recapturing towns like Zhytomyr and threatening to encircle Soviet spearheads. For several weeks, the fighting seesawed across northern Ukraine. German panzer units, though depleted, demonstrated that they still retained tactical skill and striking power. At Zhytomyr, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandart, inflicted heavy losses on Soviet mechanized corps, destroying dozens of tanks in ambushes. Yet the Germans lacked the reserves to exploit successes. By December, Soviet reinforcements restored the balance, and the Wehrmacht was compelled to retreat once again. The battles around Kiev highlighted the resilience of German armor, but also the limits imposed by attrition and overstretch. Soviet adaptation to these counterattacks was swift. Stavka redirected additional armies to stabilize the Kiev sector, while the Red Army improved coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. Bridgeheads that had been precarious in September were now expanded into deep lodgements capable of supporting mechanized operations. At Liutej, pontoon bridges were widened to allow mass crossings of tanks and self-propelled guns, enabling Soviet formations to withstand German counterstrikes. The failure of the German attempt to retake Kiev effectively sealed the Red Army's control of central Ukraine. In the south, resistance was equally fierce. German forces conducted counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads near Nikopol and Kremenchuk, attempting to eliminate them before they could be expanded. These efforts inflicted casualties but rarely succeeded in dislodging entrenched Soviet troops. By December, Soviet forces had learned to dig in rapidly upon reaching the western bank, creating fortified zones bristling with artillery and anti-tank weapons. German counterattacks, once deadly, now increasingly failed against these prepared defenses. The winter conditions added further complexity. Snow and ice altered the character of the battlefield. Frozen ground allowed for easier movement of vehicles compared to the autumn mud, but the bitter cold strained men and machines alike. Frostbite cases rose sharply among both armies, while equipment failures became common. German logistical shortages worsened as fuel and ammunition deliveries were disrupted by partisan sabotage and relentless Soviet air raids. In contrast, Soviet logistics, though still primitive, benefited from shorter supply lines as more territory was liberated and railways repaired. Civilian populations continued to suffer heavily. German scorched earth policies during their retreats left villages in ruins. Civilians who had survived occupation now faced the hardship of winter with little food or shelter. Soviet authorities, eager to reassert control over liberated areas, often requisitioned supplies, adding to the hardship. Despite this, partisan groups expanded in strength, drawing on local resentment to intensify operations behind German lines. By the end of 1943, partisan activity in right bank Ukraine disrupted German supply columns on a daily basis, further weakening the Wehrmacht's capacity to mount effective counterattacks. Psychologically, the balance of morale shifted. Soviet soldiers, though exhausted, drew confidence from the liberation of Kiev and the steady expansion of bridgeheads. German troops, by contrast, increasingly viewed the Dnieper line as a broken promise. Letters captured from German soldiers revealed despair and frustration at orders to hold positions without adequate reinforcements. Some expressed disbelief that the river, once heralded as the shield of Europe, had failed to halt the Red Army. Desertions and surrenders, while not widespread, grew more common than in earlier campaigns. Innovation became essential. Soviet engineers developed improved methods of ferrying heavy equipment across the river, including ice bridges as winter set in. German units experimented with new defensive tactics, such as creating local hedgehog strongpoints, designed to delay Soviet advances rather than trying to hold continuous lines. These adaptations reflected the evolving character of the battle. Less about storming crossings, more about sustaining footholds and countering breakthroughs. By the close of 1943, the Dnieper campaign had entered a new stage. The Soviet Union had not only secured multiple bridgeheads, but also repelled major German counterattacks. Resistance remained fierce, and the Wehrmacht demonstrated it could still launch local offensives, but the broader momentum was irreversibly shifting. The Red Army had mastered the art of sustaining operations across one of Europe's largest rivers, while the Germans struggled to adapt to the reality of prolonged defensive warfare on the western bank. This phase underscored the immense psychological and operational toll of the campaign. Both sides had endured months of attritional fighting, but the Germans now faced a reality they had long sought to avoid. The Red Army had crossed the Dnieper in force, held its ground, and was preparing for further offensives into right bank Ukraine. What had begun as a desperate race to secure bridgeheads was becoming the prelude to a larger strategic breakthrough that would push the front ever closer to the borders of Eastern Europe. The turning point of the Dnieper campaign came in late 1943, when the balance of momentum shifted decisively in favor of the Red Army. While the Germans still demonstrated tactical resilience and launched powerful counterattacks, the strategic picture was unmistakable. The Soviet bridgeheads had not only survived but expanded, and the Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to contain them all simultaneously. The dream of holding the Dnieper as an impregnable east wall collapsed, replaced by a defensive posture that could only delay, not prevent, further Soviet advances. The most decisive moment of this phase was the Soviet capture of Kiev in November 1943. Although Stalin's initial deadline had forced costly and failed attempts from the Bukrin bridgehead, the eventual success at Liutezh validated Soviet persistence. Once the capital was secured, the psychological and political impact reverberated across both sides. For the Red Army, the liberation of Kiev symbolized the recovery of Ukraine's heartland, a city that had been under German occupation since September 1941. For German soldiers and civilians alike, its loss confirmed that the tide on the Eastern Front had irrevocably turned. German counterattacks in the Kiev region during November and December initially regained some ground, most notably around Zhytomyr, Korostin, and Berdichev. Panzer divisions, including elite SS formations, delivered sharp blows, temporarily retaking towns and inflicting losses on Soviet mechanized corps. In one instance, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte destroyed more than 100 Soviet tanks in a series of ambushes west of Kiev. But these successes were fleeting. By early December, the Red Army regrouped, bringing fresh reserves and artillery into the sector. Step by step, the Germans were forced to yield again, abandoning gains they had achieved at high cost. The inability to sustain counteroffensives underscored the Wehrmacht's growing weakness. While capable of inflicting localized defeats, they lacked the reserves to maintain pressure or capitalize on victories. Southward along the Dnieper, Soviet operations continued to expand. After the fall of Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, the Red Army sought to widen its control of right-bank Ukraine. Bridgeheads near Kremenchuk and Cherkasy grew into launchpads for further offensives. German divisions fought desperately to contain them, but attrition eroded their combat power. Reports from Army Group South in November 1943 noted that many infantry divisions were reduced to 3,000–4,000 men, far below their authorized strength of 12,000–15,000. Panzer divisions often reported fewer than 50 operational tanks. The disparity in manpower and equipment became stark. Soviet fronts committed entire tank armies with hundreds of T-34s and KV tanks, while German defenders increasingly relied on hastily conscripted Volksdeutsche auxiliaries and understrength battalions. Civilian involvement in this turning point phase was significant. As Soviet forces advanced westward, they liberated millions of civilians from German occupation. Many greeted the Red Army with relief, but conditions remained dire. Infrastructure was destroyed, crops had been burned, and entire villages lay in ruins. The Soviets requisitioned supplies to sustain their armies, while NKVD units screened populations for collaborators. On the German side, forced evacuations intensified. Entire populations were marched westward, and in some cases, German commanders ordered mass deportations to labor camps. Civilians thus became unwilling participants in the shifting front lines, caught between retreat and advance. The Cherkasy bridgehead illustrates how fragile the German situation had become. Soviet forces secured the lodgment in late 1943, expanding it gradually despite constant German counterattacks. Hitler demanded that the bridgehead be eliminated, calling it a dagger pointed at Army Group South's rear. Manstein concentrated mobile divisions, launching repeated assaults to destroy it. For weeks, brutal fighting raged, with both sides suffering thousands of casualties. By early 1944, the bridgehead remained intact, setting the stage for the encirclement of German forces in the Korsun pocket. The inability to eliminate Soviet lodgments like Cherkasy reflected the fundamental shift in the campaign. Germany was no longer dictating the terms of battle, but reacting to Soviet initiatives. The Luftwaffe's decline accelerated this turning point. By late 1943, German air units could no longer contest Soviet air superiority effectively. Soviet aircraft supported bridgehead expansions with constant ground attack missions, while German attempts to destroy pontoon bridges and ferries dwindled due to fuel shortages and attrition. In many sectors, Soviet air dominance meant that German troop movements had to be conducted at night to avoid devastating losses. The decline of Luftwaffe support further eroded German ability to mount effective counterattacks, leaving ground forces increasingly isolated. Morale differences became more pronounced. Soviet troops, though weary and bloodied, were emboldened by successive victories. The liberation of Kiev and the steady collapse of German defenses instilled confidence that the war's momentum had permanently shifted. German morale, conversely, was deteriorating. Soldiers who had once believed in the Dnieper as a defensive shield now saw its failure as a sign of inevitable defeat. Letters and diaries captured by Soviet units described despair, exhaustion, and a sense of betrayal by Hitler's unrealistic orders. Manstein's frequent clashes with Hitler over the necessity of flexible defense highlighted the growing gulf between military realities and political directives. Strategically, the turning point was unmistakable. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had secured control of the entire left bank of Ukraine, captured Kiev, and held dozens of bridgeheads across the Dnieper. The Wehrmacht, although still capable of localized counterattacks, no longer possessed the means to restore the situation. The East Wall, once envisioned as a bulwark, had become a broken line. The Red Army now stood poised for deeper offensives into right bank Ukraine, threatening the German hold on the Balkans and Central Europe. Thus, the Dnieper campaign's turning point was not marked by a single decisive battle, but by the cumulative erosion of German capacity to defend and the steady expansion of Soviet control. The combination of political deadlines, relentless Soviet assaults, and German overstretch produced a transformation. The Dnieper was no longer a barrier, but a springboard. From this point onward, the Wehrmacht's struggle in the east shifted irreversibly to a defensive war of attrition, while the Red Army seized the initiative that would carry it westward into the heart of Europe. By the beginning of 1944, the struggle for the Dnieper had entered its aftermath phase, though fighting was still intense across multiple sectors. What had begun in September 1943 as a desperate race to secure or deny the river's banks had ended with the Wehrmacht driven westward and the Red Army firmly entrenched on the right bank of Ukraine. The enormous casualties and destruction left in the wake of the campaign shaped not only the operational course of the war, but also the daily lives of millions of civilians who lived along Europe's third longest river. The immediate military outcome was clear. The German East Wall had collapsed. Hitler's insistence that the Dnieper be held to the last man resulted in catastrophic attrition for Army Group South and Army Group Center. By January 1944, entire divisions had been rendered combat ineffective. Reports from Manstein's staff reveal infantry divisions holding sectors of 20-30 kilometers with only 3,000 men. Panzer divisions were often reduced to a handful of operational tanks, many reporting fewer than 40 combat-ready vehicles. The cumulative losses of the Wehrmacht during the Dnieper campaign are estimated at more than 400,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet losses were even higher, with figures ranging between 1 and 1.2 million, reflecting the immense cost of forcing the river under fire. The operational retreat of the Wehrmacht from the Dnieper opened the way for Soviet offensives deeper into right bank Ukraine. Already in January 1944, the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation developed from the Cherkasy bridgehead, encircling more than 50,000 German troops in what became known as the Little Stalingrad on the Dnieper. Although many German soldiers broke out, losses were severe, and the encirclement underscored the vulnerability of Army Group South. By March, Soviet forces had liberated towns such as Uman, Krivoy Rog, and Nikolaev, continuing to roll the front westward. The collapse of the Dnieper line meant that Germany had permanently lost eastern Ukraine, and with it, crucial industrial resources, coal from the Donbass, and agricultural production. The humanitarian consequences were staggering. Civilians who had endured 2 years of German occupation found themselves once again in the path of war. The retreating Wehrmacht applied a scorched earth policy, destroying bridges, factories, and railways. Entire villages were burned, and livestock was driven west. Deportations intensified, with tens of thousands of Ukrainians forced into labor service in Germany. Soviet advances liberated these regions, but did not immediately bring relief. Red Army units requisitioned food and shelter, often leaving local populations on the edge of famine. NKVD security detachments swiftly reimposed Soviet control, screening civilians for alleged collaboration. Arrests and deportations followed, adding to the suffering of already devastated communities. The psychological toll on both armies was immense. For the Germans, the loss of the Dnieper line shattered any lingering illusion of stability on the Eastern Front. Soldiers' diaries speak of exhaustion and resignation. Letters sent home, later intercepted, reveal despair over constant retreats and disbelief at Hitler's orders to hold fortress cities even when surrounded. For Soviet soldiers, the aftermath was a mixture of triumph and trauma. They had achieved one of the most ambitious operations of the war, but at the price of extraordinary casualties. Accounts from rifle divisions tell of regiments reduced to a few hundred men after repeated crossing attempts. Political officers worked tirelessly to frame the sacrifices as necessary for the liberation of Ukraine, but the sense of loss was deeply felt. The impact on civilians in liberated Kiev exemplifies the devastation. When the Red Army entered the city in November 1943, they found a population reduced from 850,000 before the war to barely 300,000. Entire districts lay in ruins from bombardments and German demolitions. Food shortages were acute, with bread rations minimal and fuel scarce during the winter. Soviet authorities immediately began reconstruction, but progress was slow. Civilians often survived on what little they could forage or barter, and reports described thousands homeless amid the ruins. The scars of occupation were also evident in mass graves, including the site at Baby Yar, where tens of thousands of Jews and other victims had been executed. From the perspective of international response, the crossing of the Dnieper reinforced the Soviet Union's image among its allies as a partner capable of sustained offensives. Reports reaching London and Washington emphasized the scale of the Soviet achievement, though Western observers rarely grasped the full magnitude of casualties. In Allied newspapers, the liberation of Kiev was heralded as a symbol of Axis decline. Yet behind the headlines, the sheer human cost made clear that Soviet advances were purchased at a level of bloodshed unprecedented in modern warfare. The withdrawal of the Wehrmacht from the Dnieper also had broader strategic consequences. German forces in the south were now forced to abandon plans for counteroffensives and instead focus on delaying Soviet advances toward Romania and the Balkans. The loss of Ukraine deprived Germany of vital raw materials and further strained its war economy. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath marked not just the recovery of territory, but also a springboard for future offensives. The Red Army, bloodied yet experienced, had learned to coordinate massive river crossings, integrate artillery, armor, and infantry in combined arms operations, and sustain momentum over weeks of grueling combat. These lessons would shape subsequent operations across Eastern Europe. The devastation along the Dnieper Valley was visible everywhere. Entire stretches of farmland lay unused, railways twisted, and towns reduced to rubble. Estimates suggest that over 5 million civilians were displaced during the fighting. The river itself became a graveyard for thousands of men who drowned attempting crossings or whose remains were never recovered. Veterans recalled the water choked with wreckage, horses and bodies, a testament to the enormity of the struggle. Even months later, villagers reported finding helmets, rifles, and fragments of pontoon bridges washed up on the banks. Politically, the aftermath reinforced Stalin's authority. The propaganda machine celebrated the Battle of the Dnieper as a decisive triumph. Honors were awarded on an unprecedented scale. More than 2,400 soldiers received the title Hero of the Soviet Union for actions during the crossings, the largest number for any single campaign. This recognition served both to reward bravery and to mask the appalling losses. For German leadership, the campaign deepened internal tensions. Manstein continued to argue for operational flexibility, clashing with Hitler, who insisted on holding territory regardless of military logic. The repeated failure of Hitler's directives during the Dnieper battles accelerated the erosion of trust between political and military leaders. As winter 1943-44 settled over Ukraine, the Dnieper crossings had redrawn the map of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht, drained of reserves, clung desperately to the western reaches of right-bank Ukraine. The Red Army, though battered, prepared for new offensives that would push into the heart of Europe. For civilians, the aftermath meant survival amid ruins, the search for food, and the uncertainty of renewed Soviet rule. The river had been crossed, but at a price so immense that both victors and defeated bore its scars. The immediate consequences of the battle were therefore layered and profound. The destruction of Hitler's East Wall, the liberation but devastation of Ukraine, the exhaustion yet growing confidence of the Red Army, and the irreversible weakening of the Wehrmacht. The Dnieper, envisioned by the Germans as a line of defense, had instead become the graveyard of their hopes in the East. For the Soviets, it was both a triumph and a tragedy, a victory built upon unparalleled sacrifice. The aftermath of the crossing marked not an end, but the beginning of a relentless westward drive that would carry the war into the very heart of Germany. The legacy of the Dnieper crossing was immense, shaping not only the course of the Eastern Front, but also the broader trajectory of the Second World War. Historians often point to the campaign as one of the clearest demonstrations of how attrition, geography, and political imperatives combined to produce both victory and devastation. Unlike earlier Soviet offensives, which sometimes stalled after initial breakthroughs, the Dnieper battle created an irreversible shift. The Red Army had crossed one of Europe's largest natural obstacles, broken through the last major German defensive concept in the east, and seized control of Ukraine's heartland. From a purely military perspective, the operation highlighted both the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet war effort. On the one hand, the Red Army displayed remarkable persistence, logistical innovation, and a willingness to absorb unprecedented losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. On the other, the casualties sustained, over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing, illustrated the human cost of a doctrine that often prioritized momentum over conservation of manpower. German losses were proportionally devastating. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed, captured, or forced into retreat, and divisions reduced to fragments. The Wehrmacht's reliance on scorched earth tactics and rigid directives from Hitler prevented them from conducting the kind of flexible withdrawals that might have stabilized the front. The political consequences were equally significant. For Stalin, the crossing of the Dnieper provided propaganda material to demonstrate the Red Army's unstoppable advance. The liberation of Kiev just before the anniversary of the October Revolution was trumpeted as proof of Soviet resilience and inevitability. Internationally, the victory strengthened Moscow's position with the Western Allies, who recognized that the Soviet Union had decisively seized the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. For Hitler, the collapse of the East Wall deepened tensions with his generals and exposed the limitations of his command style. The loss of Ukraine's industrial and agricultural wealth also strained the German war economy, depriving it of coal, food, and labor that had sustained the Reich since 1941. Culturally and socially, the memory of the battle became central to post-war narratives in the Soviet Union. It was celebrated as one of the defining struggles of the Great Patriotic War, with thousands of monuments and memorials erected along the Dnieper. Veterans were honored, and the campaign was taught in military academies as an example of perseverance against overwhelming odds. Yet beneath the public commemoration lay silences: the mass civilian suffering, the harsh treatment of alleged collaborators, and the extraordinary scale of Red Army losses were often omitted or downplayed in official histories. For many Ukrainian civilians, the crossing brought both liberation and the return of Soviet rule, with all its attendant hardships, including repression, deportations, and political control. German memory of the battle took a different form. For Wehrmacht veterans, the Dnieper symbolized the futility of holding rigid lines against an enemy with vast manpower reserves. Memoirs often describe the river as the grave of Army Group South, an unavoidable turning point after which hopes of victory in the East evaporated. In post-war historiography, the campaign became a case study in the consequences of Hitler's interference with military decision-making, as his insistence on defending every meter of territory prevented the Wehrmacht from conserving strength for later battles. The long-term historical significance of the battle is evident when viewed within the broader arc of the war. The Dnieper crossing effectively sealed the fate of German forces in Ukraine, opening the path for the Red Army's 1944 offensives, including the Korsun Pocket, the liberation of Odessa, and the destruction of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration. It marked the point at which the Soviet Union transformed from defending its homeland to carrying the war into Central and Eastern Europe. The momentum gained at the Dnieper carried through to the final victory in Berlin less than 2 years later. At the same time, the battle underscores the dual nature of Soviet victory: triumph achieved through immense sacrifice. The willingness to expend lives on such a scale remains a subject of historical debate, raising questions about command decisions, resource allocation, and the cost of victory. The Dnieper crossing was not only a military achievement, but also a humanitarian catastrophe for soldiers and civilians alike. Villages destroyed, families displaced, and populations decimated were as much a part of the legacy as the liberation of territory. In the end, the Dnieper campaign occupies a central place in the history of the Second World War because it combined all the elements of total war: colossal armies, immense casualties, political imperatives, and the suffering of millions. Its memory is contested and complex, viewed in Moscow as a heroic milestone, in Berlin as a tragic defeat, and in Ukraine as both liberation and loss. What remains indisputable is that the battle irrevocably altered the course of the Eastern Front, turning the Dnieper from a line of defense into the launching point for the Red Army's advance into Europe. The river, once imagined as a shield, became the pathway to Germany's eventual defeat.